Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm, of course, your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. My guest this week is Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. You can access the full 3-hour conversation on the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, but here's what I could fit into a 39-minute broadcast. So let's start by talking about why we collect retro tech. I think a lot of people confuse that we, people like you and I, collect retro tech just because, or hold on to retro tech just because we find it fascinating, which we do. Do not get me wrong. I freaking love tinkering with old technology because it helps put, the past puts perspective on the future. Look where we've been, look where we're going, and how amazing, a Palm Pilot was for its day and what it led to in modern day. That's all fascinating. But when I think about Palm Pilot, and I've just ordered a few off of eBay, I think back to when I was in 9th or 10th grade. I remember sitting in history class, pecking out notes on that Palm Pilot and how it helped me in school. It helped my grades. I was distracted and I didn't like taking notes and writing notes at the time because I was too distracted by things going on. But now I figured out a way to incorporate some technology, something I was fascinated with, into my classroom learning setting. And I took way more notes simply because I was using that Palm Pilot and that I was just geeking out about the Palm Pilot, but it wound up helping me. So that old technology puts me back in that place. I remember my friends from high school. I remember what was going on at home during that time. I remember, girlfriend at the time. Like, it puts me back equally, for the hardships and the joys in life. The tech we had at the time is imbued with those memories, those feelings. And I think, unless I'm being pedantic about this, it's more than nostalgia. There's memories in there. There's real life. There's heart in there.
It goes beyond nostalgia, because nostalgia is you're just reminiscing about the past in general.
Right.
Oh, I remember what it was like when I was a kid. I remember playing with Legos on the floor in my bedroom. Mm-hmm. They're general terms. But when you've got the tangible object, right, that's what sparks the deeper memories. Mm-hmm. Oh, I remember this Lego piece because it was unique, because it came with this one set that I really wanted, that I got for Christmas that one year. Mm-hmm. And it was from a relative who I rarely heard from, or whatever. It gets you so much deeper in. And I definitely feel the same way about a lot of that stuff. I've got a closet full of technology that I honestly never use. Yeah. But I just can't bear to get rid of.
Right. And some people would. I'm always conscious. I try never to be in denial. I'm not a hoarder, and that might be something that a hoarder says. But when you watch shows like hoarding shows, if I have no desire to have 10 Commodore 64s. I just want one Commodore.
You just need the one.
I just need the one to represent that era in computing history. Just one Atari ST. I don't care if it's a 520, 1040, whatever it is. Just one Atari ST because it was the first home computer with a GUI. I think even before the Macintosh came out. Is that accurate? I think the Atari had a GUI before the Lisa. I might be mistaken. It's one of the first.
Lisa was 83?
83, 84, I think. When was it? It doesn't matter.
They were very close.
They were very close. And
let me put it this way: if it's pedantic to care, you know what I mean? Like, they're so close, who cares?
Right. So, one of the topics I have here that I actually wrote down. Speaking of Palm Pilots and PDAs, I was trying to remember for the past few days. I remembered. Before I had the Palm Pilot, I had this other PDA in 1998. I remember specifically. It was 1998. It was 9th or 10th grade, because it was a color PDA with Windows CE, and it was the first piece of technology that absolutely broke my heart, because usually I put the things with screens in my pocket with the screen facing my leg so that the screen isn't facing out. And I learned that hard lesson the first time with a PDA in 1998, 10 years before everybody was carrying around, iPhones, that you put the screen in toward your leg, because I was walking by my history teacher's desk and it caught the corner of his desk and it shattered the screen, and my heart shattered with the screen. This thing wasn't cheap. I had to mow a lot of lawns to get it, and I had it for a few weeks, and I loved the thing, and I shattered the screen, broke my heart. But I was trying to remember the name of the device, and because I was, obviously, a lot of people in quarantine now are cruising around eBay. I'm not the only one. And I was trying to remember, what was it called? Because I sure would like to have it again if it's reasonably priced. And a lot of PDAs right now are, I would say, under $20, and some of them are way over
cheap.
That too.
It's so cheap to get into old PDAs because they're this kind of technology that I've started to refer to as a bridge technology.
Yeah.
Where they're incredibly useful at the time, but they're not something that's meant to last.
Right.
They're just to get us from an old way of doing something to a new way.
Right.
Right. So PDAs were obviously moving away from paper, but it's clear that we were eventually going to end up with smartphones. Right. And PDAs just wouldn't be needed anymore.
Exactly. So I remembered the device. I went to Wikipedia, and I just Googled 1998 PDAs, and I found a list, and it was such a fascinating mental, to observe my brain doing what my brain was doing. Those old, crusty, rusty, corroded synapses that haven't fired in 20 years to remember the name of that device. And when I saw Nino, Nino, and I was like, that's what it was. Philips Nino. I had a Philips Nino, the 500 with the color screen. That was my first PDA. And it felt like a high. That's the best way I could describe it. It was like restarting an old engine that hadn't been started in 30 years.
And then all the memories start flooding back.
And it's like meeting an old friend you haven't seen in 20 years. All right, we'll have to leave the conversation there for just a moment. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up, more retro tech memories. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger, and my guest is Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. The vaporwave bump music I'm using is provided by an artist named Dan Mason, and I'll include links to his stuff, of course, in the podcast. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I am, of course, your mental curator. The vaporwave bump music you're listening to throughout the show is provided by Dan Mason. I will, of course, leave links to his music in the podcast, so make sure you get the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast app. And we're going to continue the conversation now with Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute about where to start maybe in collecting retro tech. It's no surprise that a lot of vintage tech is getting very expensive. If you want a Walkman, the D6C Walkman, it's like $1,000 now on eBay.
There's
lucky.
A lot of those like 80s vintage like Walkmans, even the CD players, the Discmans. Mm-hmm. Some of those are several $100 for a Discman. It's nuts.
Skyrocket. You would never have thought. One of the PDAs that I remembered that I had, it was a compact iPack 3150, and that's meaningful for a number of reasons. One is compact has long since gone away. It was one of the first, not Windows CE, but Pocket PC, once they changed over from Windows CE to Pocket PC. And what did they call it? Windows 5. Windows Mobile?
Windows Mobile.
Yeah, Windows Mobile. So it was kind of a pivotal piece of tech, and that I might actually have that in a box up in my attic. I need to go look above the garage for that. But those are quite expensive. There's a couple $100s for used. Some PDAs can be a couple $100, but by and large, on the whole, they're pretty cheap. And the question to you, the topic I want to bring up to you was, since a lot of vintage gear, like Walkman and some Discman, are hundreds of dollars, if not over $1,000, a lot of vintage gear is expensive. PDAs right now are extremely cheap. They are very dirt cheap. And my thoughts are that if you are somebody who's even vaguely interested in vintage tech, that PDAs would be a good place to start. If you set a budget of $25, $30 and say, yeah, I remember the Palm Pilot, or I never had a Palm Pilot. I think that, like a lot of areas of tech, I think PDAs, I'm not saying within the next year or the next 5 years, I don't know if it's going to happen, but we didn't know it was going to happen with Walkman, that it could get expensive again, that you won't be able to find a handspring visor for $17 over the next few years. They might start going up in price again. So it's just my idea that if you're vaguely interested in getting into vintage technology, and it pains me to call something from the early 2000s vintage at this point.
I know, right? It was 20 years ago, dude.
But that's a good place to start because of exactly what you said. This is a bridge technology. These were the granddaddies to the iPhone and the Samsungs and the Androids and whatever we have in our pocket. This is where it started. So I want your opinion on this. It seems like a good place to go for some for a grasp on the past that I think a lot of people, even younger people, can appreciate. There's a lot of people born in the early 2000s who might want to go look at the tech that was available in the early 2000s. And it's really interesting to me to scroll through YouTube and find people that there's no way they're over 25 years old. There's no way they were born after the Palm Pilot that they're reviewing. And it's refreshing to see a lot of these really young people praising these old devices, saying there's qualities about this old device.
It's really interesting. There's like a split, right? So you've got the people who grew up with it, and now they're looking at it again, like you and I are, because we used it back then and we want to reminisce.
Right.
So we're the, in quotes, experts because we lived through it. We remember when it was new, when it didn't work right, what it took to get it working right, back then, how it improved, all the tricks and the tweaks and the hacks and everything you could do to make it better, right? But then you've got all the younger folks who didn't live through that, and they're experiencing that retro tech for the first time. Yeah. So their only basis of comparison is what was that stuff like compared to now. Right. They can't say, okay, here's how Palm versus Windows CE was like. Here's what that battle was like. They never lived through that battle. They can only look at the two products side by side and compare them kind of objectively. All like Palm is like this and Windows Mobile or Windows CE is like that. But they couldn't say, you know what, back in the day, if you were anybody, you had a Palm device. Yeah. Or if you did this kind of work, you always had a Windows CE device because Palm couldn't do it or whatever. They didn't. They just didn't live through that experience. But it is really, really heartening to see the younger folks getting into the retro tech and getting interested in it. Now, I actually am not necessarily surprised by it because I do think we have, in some ways or another, this interest in what came before us. Yeah. If for no other reason than to kind of put our own current experience into perspective. Right. The best way that I can think of to kind of explain it is like, I'm sure you have. I'm a big fan of him. We've both listened to Jimi Hendrix. Oh, yeah. Regularly. He died before we were born. Right. Right. We didn't live through his era. But we both listened to Jimi Hendrix, and I think we both like him. We both recognize he's a huge talent. Yeah. But we don't have that experience of that era, of when he was the new thing, the current thing, and who the other artists at the time were in comparison to him. Yeah. But we still have that appreciation. I think that's kind of the same way to look at it. Right. And the problem that I have is some of the, in quote, expert people, like I was describing, those who lived through the era, some of them tend to look down on the younger people who are experiencing the retro tech, and they almost use it like as a badge of honor. Right. You can't possibly imagine. I lived through the era. You have no idea, And it's like, dude, shut up. Who are you to say that?
Don't ruin it.
You should be appreciating these younger generations getting into this tech. You should be helping them. You should be explaining to them, here's what it was like. And oh, by the way, here's some other cool things you can do with it, because a lot of that information came out when the internet really wasn't a thing or wasn't as big.
Help pass the torch.
Right. We're still relying on some of that like institutional knowledge of retro technology to pass on to other people. And so that just drives me nuts, when they gatekeep like that with the old tech. But to take it a step back about PDAs in general, absolutely. I think it's a great time to get into them. And the timing is actually really good right now, not just because of the price, because they're, definitely very cheap to get into. Right. But also the technology existed at a time that's still kind of compatible with what we have now. Right. Yeah. You don't need to set up this gigantic retro tech experience to experience the one part of it. Right. So a lot of Palm devices, handspring devices, Windows CE devices were capable of synchronizing over USB. Right. Well, what kind of port do you still have on your computer now? Yep. And even if you can't get Palm Desktop to install on 64-bit Windows 10, you can fire up a virtual machine. Right. Like, other than the cost of buying the hardware, it costs you nothing but your time to get that hardware working on the other modern equipment you have today. You're right. And the internet was a thing in the late 90s, and that was where we started to see things like programs getting spread between users. So a lot of the archives of like Palm and Windows CE programs are still out there. They're still there. So it's a great time. You don't have to rely on buying these like miscellaneous boxes of floppy disks off of eBay and hoping that, the program you want is on there, or even having to go through the arcane process of, okay, I downloaded this old Apple II program, but how do I write it to a 5 1/4 floppy disk? Right. Well, now you need, multiple steps of technology to do it. Right. With the PDAs, download it, save it to your computer, run Palm Desktop, boom, you're done. It's so easy. And also because the devices are small, it's not much of a commitment, even in terms of space. Right. Like you can buy a bunch of them just to get that kind of full gamut experience. Like I've got an entire bit. I've got like probably 8 or 9 PDAs. Yeah. But they fit in like a tiny little storage container. They take up no space. So you're not committing an entire closet or an entire basement to the thing either. It's great.
It always helps when collecting is cheap and doesn't take up much space. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. One more time, the Vaporwave bump music is provided by Dan Mason. All the links will be in the podcast, the Geek Therapy Radio podcast, so make sure you go check it out in your favorite podcast app. We're going to continue the conversation, though, now with Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. Remember Palm Pilots? Let's continue that discussion. Yeah, so specifically, if you're trying to get into the Palm operating system, experience what Palm was before. Palm did move on to such things as smartphones eventually. But
Palm got weird over time, yeah.
And it changed hands a few times. They licensed it out to other companies, Sony, and then unlicensed it. Unlicensed it. It got really weird. But I would suggest if someone... really, it's so cheap that you can get both. One Palm device, I would say, and it's just because it's the most, maybe it's just because it's the most recent that I've ordered. The Palm 3 X, Palm 3 XE or EX.
XE.
Yeah, Palm 3 XE, because that's an actual Palm device. But I would also recommend the handspring visor. It's the same Palm operating system, but the reason I would suggest the handspring visor, personally, I think it looks better. I like the more monolithic look of it. It has an extra a card port. I don't want to call it.
The backpack, I think, is what they called those.
Right.
Or is that what they called those? The backpack modules?
They definitely called modules.
It was the expansion slot on the back, and that initially is what set. Well, arguably, it's the only thing that set Handspring apart.
Right. From
Palm. So Handspring was a bunch of engineers that used to work for Palm.
Right.
That the typical, this happens so much in technology. They got pissed at management at Palm. They didn't like the direction things were going. They thought they could do it better. So they split out and formed their own company. Mm-hmm. But they still liked the Palm OS. So they licensed it from Palm. Handspring was, I believe, one of the first licensees for Palm that wasn't doing just like modified hardware.
Right.
Like Symbol. I actually had this in one of my videos. Symbol, the people who make barcode scanners.
Yeah.
Like they had a modified version of a Palm 3. It looks just like a Palm 3, but it's a bit thicker because they integrated a barcode scanner into it. And it was designed for people like working in warehouses and stuff for scanning inventory.
Yeah.
I mean, those obviously existed for a while, but yeah, the Handspring, those were like the first ones, I think, that were their own discrete hardware, and they actually just fully licensed the Palm OS. Mm-hmm. They were not a whole lot different than what Palm was producing at the time.
Right.
So it's the same, like form factor, the performance was about the same, the quality of the screen was about the same. The big thing really was that expansion slot on the back. And so you could get like memory storage for it. You could get, I believe they even had like an MP3 player module. Yes,
MP3, GPS.
Modems, all sorts of crazy stuff. Yeah.
So the biggest reason why I was suggesting Handspring is that the cradle was USB. And I think,
you could get USB cradles for the Palm 3 as well, I believe.
Could you? Maybe.
Don't quote me on it. That Palm had USB around that same time.
Whether it did or didn't, it's not that difficult to go from a serial to USB.
Yeah, just get the serial to USB adapter.
Too. But the Handspring, I know, just because I just ordered it a night or two ago, the cradle was straight up USB. There's no, you definitely know that you're not going to have to go with an adapter or anything like that, and that there's a strong likelihood that, like you said, even through a virtual machine, or even easier than that, that PCs back in the late 90s, my Pentium 3 Dell Latitude C800 or whatever laptop has a couple of USB 1.0 ports, along with serial, along with printer ports, along with SCSI, whatever. But USB, we still use it today in 2020, but it dates back even over 20 years. So again, I think that's a good reason why PDAs are such a good jumping off point for people interested in retro tech, because it's compatible even with a lot of devices today. Not perfectly compatible, but like you're saying, 64.
Well, you can get them up and running. It's easier to get exploring with them.
Right. Exactly. And they're cheap now, and you might as well go. I don't want to, put a run on eBay for PDAs and start jacking up the prices of them, but get 2 or 3. You can have 2 or 3 of them for less than $40. Shipping included.
Oh yeah, and you can get a nice kind of swath of the technology as well. You can get like an earlier one, you can get a later one, you can get one in the middle, and you can see how that technology progressed, because it actually progressed pretty quickly. I mean, all said and done, PDAs were only a thing for maybe 10 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If that, and they were only popular within those 10 years for maybe 5. Yeah, it's really a thing that like it was there for a while, and then it hit and people jumped on it, and then it rapidly improved, and then smartphones. Let me tell you something, and maybe you have a similar experience here. Back to 1998, when I had that Philips Nino, and I'm still geeking out that I remember the name of it and found one. When I've had that Philips Nino, it was 9th grade. I was made fun of quite a bit for having that PDA, for being called a geek or a nerd. We're taking those terms back. Geeks are sexy now, obviously. But I wasn't bullied over it, but people make fun of me. What is that? You friggin' Star Trek communicator thing. And I vividly remember telling all of these people,
just watch. In the next 10 years, you're going to be the outcast if you don't have one of these. This is what your phone's going to be. We had cell phones, not early cell phones, but maybe, earlier cell phones. We didn't have smartphones, black and white Nokias, and probably even earlier than that, late 90s. It was probably the red. It wasn't quite the big Zach Morris bricks.
Late 90s, yeah, that would be like the Nokia.
Right.
That'd be like the Nokia era. The early 90s, I think, is what you're thinking about, like the analog.
Right.
The analog, the Motorola StarTAC.
Yeah.
Some of the not the original Dynatac, but some of the later ones, the flip phones that were still pretty big bricks. early
90s, I want to say 91 or 92. I was cruising around. I'll get back to PDAs in a second, but I was cruising around with my best friend, John. We were going to the Galleria down here in Houston, and I was going to be with them later than usual. So his parents said, you might want to call your mom and ask if you can, stay with us for a little longer or whatever. And I was sitting in the back seat of the Ford Explorer thinking, okay, I guess I'll use a payphone, once I get to the mall. What wound up happening was his dad handed back this giant brick of a thing. I was like, what? I had never even seen. I didn't know this. My immediate thought as a little kid was, my parents don't have this walkie-talkie. There's no way I can contact them with this giant walkie-talkie. And he turned it on. There was a dial tone. Beep, boop, beep, beep, boop. What? And I remember cruising down the highway with this gigantic, my hand was a foot away from my head because the battery pack was gigantic.
Oh, yeah.
And my mom picked up the phone and was like, how are you talking to us right now? I was like, we're in the car. I'm
yelling really loudly.
It's a cellular. They call it a cellular telephone. I kind of knew that car phones existed, but I had certainly never been in a car with a car phone, and this was just a regular kind of Ford Explorer. It certainly didn't have a car phone. I believe car phones technically existed all the way back. I was watching a video back into like the 40s. They were dabbling with radio telephones that would basically... Yeah,
they were much closer to walkie-talkies back then.
Yeah. But it
wasn't until I'd like to say the 70s is when they got it kind of closer to being like the traditional phone experience.
Right, what we know
now. And even
now.
then the technology was still very much based on like kind of walkie-talkie type of stuff.
Yes.
It wasn't really until they went digital where it wasn't shared spectrum. It's kind of fascinating. There was capacity limitations on cell phones back then simply because of the number of available frequencies.
Right.
So whenever you placed a call to the tower, you and the tower had to reserve a specific frequency for each direction of the conversation.
Yeah. And
so you could only have because obviously if two phones ended up on the same channel, then suddenly now you're on somebody else's phone call.
Yeah. And it's still similar with ham radios and the way ham radios operate and offset frequencies and tones that you send out to make sure you secure a position in the repeater and blah, blah, blah. The technology's old, hasn't changed that much in certain areas, but as far as phones as we know them, or mobile phones as we know them, back in the 40s, I wasn't doubting you, but you're absolutely right that it was more like a glorified walkie-talkie. It's always so interesting to look back at the technology we take for granted today. More Geek Therapy Radio coming up. My guest is Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. The bump music is provided by Dan Mason. Don't go anywhere.
Every time I cry, I will always know it's coming back to me.
Back to Geek Therapy Radio. I'm your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. Okay, let's pick up the conversation with Colin from the YouTube channel This Does Not Compute. We were talking about, for some reason, cell phones back in the 1940s. Let's see where the conversation goes. So you'd be out in your mobile work truck. You'd pick up the phone. It looked like a phone. What's funny is it looked like an actual rotary, gigantic thing under the dash of your truck. And you'd pick it up, and you would just tell the operator. You pick it up, and the operator on the other end.
Yeah, the operator. It was basically like a walkie-talkie between you and the operator, and then the operator would patch you into the phone network.
Exactly, and you had to be within, a line of sight of the tower. They would put the radio tower on the top of the fire station or something to get it above the city, and the idea was they would have repeaters, all over the landscape every 10 or 12 miles, so that these work trucks could have constant radio communication. But it's a walkie-talkie that was patched into the phone network, basically. But all that stuff way back to World War II, and it's very fascinating how it all worked out. But back to the PDAs in 1998, getting made fun of for my Philips Nino. I said, everyone's going to have this. You're going to be the outcast if you don't have this, and this is going to be the telephones. It's all coming together within the next 10 years. Mark my words. I had no idea that Apple would be the one to bring the iPhone or BlackBerry or anything like that. But it was this magical time, like you were saying. I think it was even around 10 years, maybe 5 years, that PDAs were a thing, especially in business. Only high-powered business professionals had a Palm Pilot or a Windows CE device. It wasn't just normal high school plebs like me that just thought they were really cool. And then it became, by the time I was in my senior year, I graduated in 2002. I think I got a cell phone the last part of my senior year in 2002. The legendary Nokia 3310, black and white, had Snake, could make T9 texts, Snake. And you had to pay for minutes, and you can only Snake. You can only pay. It's like 100 texts a month, like whatever. That's the other thing. Yeah,
minutes and texts.
Minutes and texts. But while I was graduating from high school, that was when it was only the latter part of high school that senior year that it started becoming. You were a dork if you didn't have a phone, whereas just before
that's really interesting. That's when that 99, 2000, 2001 time period. That's really when it started to turn, wasn't it? Because the technology was starting to come down in price enough where the high school kids could get into it.
Right.
And just consumers in general could start to get into it. Like you said, the PDAs at first, they were expensive, and you use them for business. For work, I have to conduct transactions and all that kind of business crap.
Yeah.
Later in the 2000s, I'd like to say somewhere around like 2003, maybe 2004, PDAs were getting cheap. Like $100-ish cheap.
Yeah, I remember seeing handsprings for like $50.
Trickling down. Yeah. Yeah, like the Palm, what is it? The Palm M series.
Yeah, M100.
I'm picturing one in my head. It's like the 105 or whatever.
Right.
That's probably the wrong one. But
no, you're right. That's right.
It's like this very plasticky. It kind of looks cheap, but it was just as functional.
Right.
And that was like the PDA for the masses, you know, and you could get the fold-up keyboards and everything. That's basically what I did in college. I mean, you're talking about taking notes in class. That's what got me started to actually really study in college. Was I had my handspring visor and one of those fold-up keyboards, and during lecture, I'd just sit there and take notes. I would literally outline everything that came out of the instructor's mouth, and what I found was I didn't really need to study as much after having done that.
Yeah.
It was like the process of listening to what they said, distilling it down in my mind into bullet points, and typing it out was enough to start to bake it in.
Right. And anything that helps you study and comprehend burn the information into your brain was a win. My college experience was at the beginning. What was the first year of college that I went to my first class? Probably 2003 or 4. I didn't go immediately after high school. I spent a year in California going to recording engineering school. So I guess I did. I mean, I started school immediately, but I got a certificate before I actually went into a 4-year school. But so I would say 2005 is probably my first 4-year college experience, and I had my laptop and all the students in the class were looking at me, this guy with a laptop, and even some of the professors were like, can you put that away? It's distracting. Like, you can't be typing tick, 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 tick. It's distracting everybody else. And I said, okay. So I went to notes. A few years later, everybody was using laptops, and I had been forced and gotten used to my notebook again. So people were staring at me with my pencil and paper
what
like a caveman.
What are you doing writing this stuff down, dude? Yeah.
Everyone had their Macs out, type, and I became the odd man out again in a cruel, vicious circle. Because at that time, writing it down was better for me. So I found myself too distracted with my Windows XP laptop, opening up other stuff or playing pinball or doing whatever, typing. What my problem is that, yes, I would open up Microsoft Word, or what was the other one? The other popular one. What was it? Works? Was it Works?
Well, yeah, Works was what would usually just come with your computer, because Word was part of Office, and Office used to be stupid expensive back then.
Yeah. So my problem is I would open up whatever word processor I was using, and I would just start typing stupid stories to show my friends later. And so what happened, that's why I went back to the notebook, is because I'm just going to be typing stupid little scripts and stories to show my friends later. I'm not going to actually take notes. You
finally graduate college. Your parents are like, well, what did you get from college? Well, I got all F's in my class, but I have written this really awesome novel.
My transcripts keep saying if, incomplete and failure and incomplete and failure. Oh my goodness. Okay, so we've covered PDAs in the transition to smartphones. This is all great. There's one other bullet point, at least. Well, there's only one other bullet point. I don't know what we'll get to here, but I'm sure we'll start wrapping it up at some point. A little bit of a curveball, a little bit of out of left field here. So the new iPhone SE, right? SE has come out.
SE2. SE2. I don't know if they're calling it the SE2, but it's the SE, yeah.
With the A3 or A13 Bionic chip, $399 starting price. Blah blah blah. I think it's going to be an absolute smash hit for Apple.
Yeah, there's no doubt. No doubt.
Absolutely, credit where credit's due. I like overall the last 6 or 7 months, maybe year, of this transition Apple has seemed to make back towards making the products even better by getting rid of the butterfly keyboard, making the new MacBook Pros a little thicker so that they can have better thermal design. Listening to the people saying we're tired of spending $1,200 on the phone. There are people among us, among the consumers, who just want a good $400 smartphone, middle of the ground smartphone, and I think again Apple is just going to smash it out of the park with the SE2. But anytime, this is what I'm getting at, anytime Apple or any major manufacturer launches it's not flagship, but a kind of a watermark product, some sort of product that's going to do well, go gangbusters, the fanboyism comes out. So what my question is to you, I want to get your thoughts on fanboyism in general. And I know we're both adults, and maybe fanboyism isn't so huge among our age group. Even I feel like I'm stupid for saying that, because I think there's a lot of people that are fanboys.
Still is.
So still is. There we go. There's the spark. What do you think about fanboyism? Is it helpful or not helpful?
It's both. Fanboyism is just part of the human condition.
And there's 2 more hours to that conversation with Colin from This Does Not Compute on YouTube, so make sure you download the Geek Therapy Radio podcast in your favorite podcast player. The bump music was provided by Dan Mason, who you can find at danmason.bandcamp.com. If your classic or modern car is having trouble, visit my friends at Best Automotive in Kingwood on North Park. Thank you so much for listening to Geek Therapy Radio. You are worthy of love.